Doesn't look like we have a quorum for the accept those minutes, do we? From the last, nope. So we'll just move forward to the next agenda item, and we'll just keep going. But first, we'll do introductions, and I'll start with myself. Hello, everyone. Welcome to coming to our today's police accountability, police transparency and accountability task force meeting. I am Darryl McGraw. I'm the chair of that meeting, and also this meeting here is our public awareness subcommittee meeting that you are attending, and we welcome you all. And I'll move to Mr. Clark. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Andrew Clark from the IMRP, and we are assisting the task force.
Awesome, awesome. Tamara, how are you?
Good afternoon, Tamara Lanier, New London, NAACP.
Good to see you. Mr. Barone, how are you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Ken Barone from CCSU IMRP.
Chief Mello, I see you in the building. How are you, sir? Chief Mello, how are you, Richard? Checking in with you. Oh, there's Chief Mello.
Doing well, thank you, Darryl. I'm Richard Frieder from Everyday Democracy.
Good to see you. Chief Mello, good to see you. How are you, sir?
You as well, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Mello, the Chief of Police of the City of Milford.
Awesome. Mackenzie, how are you doing today?
Hi, Mr. Chair. Mackenzie Joseph with CCSU IMRP.
Awesome. And I believe we have Brandy.
Hi, yes, Brandy Kennedy, the UConn School of Social Work and New Horizons Domestic Violence Services.
Oh, good to see you. Or hear you, rather. And I don't want to say that name wrong. Michonne? And we'll move on to, we don't have a quorum to accept it. Andrew, could you put the agenda up for me, please? Oh, we got a couple, Henry's here. Henry's here twice. Thank you. Henry, we just did introductions.
Domestic violence.
Hi, Henry Alphonse with IMRP and CCSU.
Good to see you, Henry. You're here twice. Double the fun. So we don't have enough members to vote on to accept the minutes. We will go to the third agenda item, and that is the findings from the recommendations in the law enforcement from Dr. Ann Cringen. How are you, Dr. Ann? We're going to go right to you. I know you're used to us waiting to like the last, but you are on stage right now. We welcome you and thank you for all the work you've done.
Great, thank you so much for having me. So we have put all of the recommendations in a written document, obviously, and have sort of the rationale behind each one. And so maybe we should just cover the recommendations on any questions. One of the things that we sort of framed this around was the 2015 sort of bill that we have in the very beginning. And then the idea of recommendation of sort of an oversight and accountability related to that. So perhaps maybe we just open it up for questions since it's all in written format that you've been able to review, or any feedback on things that were maybe unclear in this particular document. We also have a companion document to the recommendations, which just gives a little bit sort of meat and understanding of some of the research that's out there related to recruiting and hiring and things that agencies should consider. Michelle, who's working with Andrew and his team, did a great job with sort of the mock ads on, what would nudging look like and what are some of the things that police departments should consider when trying to recruit a diverse population.
Thank you, Dr. Cringen. We will open it up, and we just want to remind everyone that we're going to forward these after. If we'll move to questions if people have comments. I think Chief Mello, you just unmuted. Tamara, I'm happy that you're here because this is one of the topics that you have brought up early when we started the task force. So this is something that I'm interested in hearing if you've had an opportunity to meet with Dr. Cringen. If not, and review some of the information that Dr. Cringen has put forth. But just keeping in mind that we will be moving this to the full task force, these recommendations to the full task force as we indicated in the email. So we won't be taking a vote today because we do not have a quorum, but we can talk about any suggestions or recommendations, changes that should be made before we actually present it to the full task force. Chief Mello, did you have something?
And excuse me 1 second, Mr. Chair, just as you mentioned the documents, I just wanted to make people aware that might be watching on CTN or otherwise or at the meeting and don't have them. If you go to the ctpolicetransparency.com website under meetings and the public awareness subcommittee, those documents are all there.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Going back to opening it up to questions, comments in reference to the recommendations that was put forward.
Mr. Chairman, on my document, the documents I have on page 2, there's recommendation 1 and 2, and then it looks like it skips over to page 4 to recommendation 5. Am I missing something? Is there a recommendation 3 and 4 that I'm missing?
Let's look at that. Let's all take a look.
Does anyone have it that they can share? I mean, I don't have it in my recent emails. I did look at it prior to Ann and I talking, but that was some time ago. And
Can we bring the document up just so we can make sure that all the pages, all the members have the pages? And we can go through that just really quickly, if we could do that.
that would help.
Is this the document here?
Sorry, yes. I think. Can you see it there?
We do see it now. Yes, thank you.
And Andrew, I'm going to go through and look at the old version because one of the things that I'm a little bit concerned about is perhaps when we were working off an older document that had one column. And then we wanted to put it into the 2 columns so it would match the original first document and also so it would be shorter. But I just want to make sure that I have all of the information in there because it does look like we're missing one of the recommendations. So let me check.
Okay, if we can check that. And thank you, Chief Mello, for catching that, making sure that we're not missing anything.
Yeah, so the first page of the document that was shared and that's on the site is the page that everybody should be familiar with. That's just the kind of background documentation on regarding diversity in policing, in particular in Connecticut, and talking about the value of it, both in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of gender, and which also has links to some of the recent literature on the topic. The second page does start the recommendations, and here's where Chief Mello referenced there's the recommendation 1 here and recommendation 2, but that it does go not in this page, but in this last page to recommendation 5. So,
So there's a page missing?
yes. So that's what Dr. Cringen's just taken a look at, but I could walk through at least the first one. And the first one is really thanks to Henry. This is a new one. And Henry, who works with our office, was doing a search for past statutes relative to police transparency and accountability and came across the Connecticut General Statute 7-291B that was part of a public act that required that law enforcement units develop and implement guidelines for the recruitment, retention, and promotion of minority officers. in the goal of which achieving racial, gender, and ethnic diversity. So I think the thinking behind this is, given that that had been a prior statute and a goal set forth by the legislature, signed by the governor, and that we certainly weren't aware of it within the task force, at least as members that were working on this particular issue, but that, you know, they also, the General Assembly asked the task force to take a look at that. It seemed to us to indicate that there was some value in having an oversight entity, recognizing that the task force will go out of its charge the end of this particular year. So I think the Office of the Inspector General seemed like a natural place. And there's the rationale. So I don't know if you want to take them one at a time or.
Well, while we're going, if we can go through them, because I think that just, if we could just, you know, briefly go through them. I know Dr. Prince has done enough presentations on them, but I think that was just a quick overview for those that weren't there, and just understanding what we are talking about and what we're putting forth, and making sure that what we have on the website and the information that we're giving out is making sure that there's nothing missing for people. As we figured out, did we figure out is there a difference, Dr. Cringer?
Yeah, it was just a typo on my end. I forgot that instead of making some of the strategies, the original document had multiple strategies for individual agencies, but that because this is going on at the state level, we nested those strategies in. So it was a typo on my end. We have really 3 substantial recommendations, and then this is the information that informs the larger recommendations. So the typo is, instead of 5, it should be 3. All pages are okay and included.
And just for my own clarity, number 5 should be 3.
Correct. And I'll make sure to send out a correct document to Andrew to have it disseminated.
Okay. And then I guess that information was all consolidated, like you put it all together. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarity. So we have 3. Andrew, would you like to just touch base, or Dr. Cringen, either or is there any questions so far before we move to the second recommendation? Chief Mello.
Mr. Chairman, are you going to, if you're asking for questions about one, if you're going to take it one at a time, then I have some questions for one, but I thought you had said you wanted to go through all of them and then back and then entertain questions. What's your preference?
Whatever works. Do you have questions for them? Let's just go through all 3, and then we'll bring the question. I think it'd be easier for that, if that works, and the sake of time for everyone as well. So we'll go through all 3. Mr. Clark, do you mind, or Dr. Cringen, either or, just do a quick overview on, Andrew's already done 1, so we're going to do 2 and 3, and then if there's any questions, we'll do that at that time.
Sure, absolutely. So for recommendation number 2, state level dissemination of promising practices in recruiting, hiring, promotion, training, and to make sure that we're supporting diversification. So one of the things that's really challenging is that agencies often don't have the information that might lead them to making those types of changes. So I think it would be really advantageous at the state level to sort of start taking that initiative and step. We've already said that there should be some sort of implementing guidelines of the recruiting, retention, and promotion of minority officers. However, the challenge is, have we actually well equipped those agencies with best practices? So I've outlined in the rationale some of the research that's out there related to recruiting and hiring, and some of the promising practices given some of the randomized trials that have been done in this area. And so I'll leave everyone to read those on an individual basis, but we do have the research footnotes in there, so you can find the sources as well.
Thank you.
And then for recommendation 3, which is written as 5 in the document that's currently on the website, is data collection, right? As we move towards wanting to have evidence-based practices, our practices are only evidence-based as good as our data actually is, right? And often agencies don't collect the data or don't know how to. Some of this can be really simplified, but really at the state level, having agencies be accountable to reporting out those numbers would be really, really helpful to see, are some of these changes, right, actually moving the needle and changing forces in departments, and that it shouldn't just be specific agencies necessarily choosing to, but can we actually look at this as a larger scale, state level kind of interest, and then see the patterns that emerge. It would be really challenging, especially for smaller departments with smaller sample size, to be able to make any sort of inferences from the data that they would be collecting. And so I think that there are advantages to departments that maybe are smaller, that wouldn't have the necessary resources and wouldn't necessarily think about doing it due to a smaller sample size. So recommendation 3 is basically saying, hey, let's collect the data to actually ensure that the recommendations that we're making at the state level are having the intended effect. Are there any unintended consequences? But also making sure that at each step, whether it's hiring, whether it's training, that we actually know what those numbers look like. On the national level, the only way that we actually do know about law enforcement personnel is through the LEMIS survey, which is done every 4 years. And so it would be really advantageous for Connecticut to have that accurate picture on a yearly basis, as opposed to looking at what the national trend is outside of Connecticut.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Any questions in reference to the 3 recommendations that were presented today?
Mr. Chairman, I do.
Yes.
First of all, let me again thank Dr. Cringen for her work and informing us about her research and giving us her perspectives and very informed opinions. And so I've seen a lot of this before. I mean, we've spent a lot of time bringing in researchers like Dr. Cringen to talk to us on a state level and on a regional level. But some of it, I think, is even beyond what I've seen. I think it's innovative, and so I support what's in there in terms of strategies to certainly to recruit and to hire. There are problems far beyond this when it comes to modern day, which we didn't have prior to 2020, in trying to attract people and to retain people. And that's not part of the conversation here today. And I think it's something that certainly needs to be examined, and how do you incentivize people to want to go into this work? And Dr. Cringen talked a little bit about that. And a lot of this is being done, albeit piecemeal. Different agencies are doing different things, and it's tough to know what certain agencies are doing. So I certainly support that. But I'd like to really direct my questions on recommendation 1. And so I'm well aware of that. In fact, there's further guidance and even legislation, even going as far as most recently as the police accountability bill, regarding agencies that have a high concentration of minority residents. And even further, every department, based upon the police accountability bill, has to be CLIA certified by 2025. As part of the certification process, you have to have a plan similar to what's in 7291B. And so those are coming in to post, actually, because right now there's no real good depository, and we really suffer from not having that central depository for information. And I've talked to Ken about this before. The state, Connecticut, needs to really get serious and start to provide those resources in that structure, so we have one central place where this stuff comes in, and the staff is available to analyze this stuff and get those findings out to the people in the field that need it. But in terms of recommendation 1, so 7291B talks about, shall implement and develop guidelines. And as I read on from recommendation 1, it's talking about having the OIG with the authority to audit and enforce the statute. Are you saying enforce the fact to ensure that departments actually have developed and are implementing guidelines, which is part of the audit process of CALIA and of Tier 3? Or is that what you're suggesting, or are you suggesting even going further and looking at the actual numbers of staff and enforcing that type of, I don't want to use the word, that kind of requirement to say that if your municipality has a certain percentage of a certain demographic, that the agency must reflect that regardless of any other factor? And so I'm just curious on what you're looking at there.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's more about the report out of the numbers, right? And whether practices such as the things in recommendation 2 are being part of something that the agency is trying to do, right? And so in reading, in thinking about this, right, the challenge is if there's no accountability, right, there's no way in which agencies necessarily have the impetus to change, right? And so I think that it's more about, are they doing these things, right? Not necessarily saying this has to match the community, right? Have these hard conversations all the time, which is, is that even what we mean when we talk about just diversification? Because then you can have areas, right, that have less diversity. And would you say, well, now we can't have a person who is, who's Latino because of this reason? And so I think that's not the overall goal. The goal is to say, are you making these kind of best practice attempts to diversify? But I absolutely understand. Let me do maybe I can reconsider what the language is that perhaps makes it unclear for recommendation 1.
I think that would be helpful, Dr. Crington, especially because you're looking at the OIG, which is basically a prosecutor, and it gives the impression that there'd be some sort of criminal penalty. And so I think because right now Post does that, and so what Post does in terms of Tier 3 certification or adherence to the language in the police accountability bill is just to make sure that you have that policy and that it's in practice. It doesn't look at supporting data to really measure the effectiveness. And so I would endorse that, but I'm not sure it belongs in the IG's office, because when you look at the role of the IG, the current role, and for a prosecutor to be looking at that, maybe there's no other place to put it. I'm not sure, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other questions in reference to any of the other recommendations that Dr. Crington presented on today? Comments, questions?
Dr. Crington, and I don't know if this is your work or not, but I do like where you've put, and let me see if I can locate it, and it has to do with moving in a direction, or and it really has to do with training. And that's Sue Rear coined the frame guardians versus warriors. We still don't accept that. It's not an either or. And you were a law enforcement officer, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I like that because it doesn't give the mandate to say that you cannot have any type of stress training, because when we hear that, we start to think, adherence to instructions, following, instructions in very difficult and stressful situations, and making sure that people can function in a very stressful environment. And I could be here for days giving you examples, or you can just go on Google and look on YouTube and look at hundreds and hundreds of examples. So I like the messaging there, the way that was worded. And I'm sorry, for some reason, I just can't find it now, but you know what I'm talking about. We're towards moving in that direction as opposed to an absolute mandate. We haven't been moving in that direction on our own for all the reasons that you brought up. And again, I apologize if somebody can find that. Oh, here it is right here. It's on page 3. or adopt or expand adult or active learning principles in academy training. Second bullet point, reduce emphasis on paramilitary approaches to training. I think it's important that it's worded that way, not to give the impression because that we wouldn't eliminate the stress portion of training in various aspects that is so important, because I feel, and many of my colleagues would agree, that when police officers can't make decisions, especially forced decisions that are the most stressful and unpredictable, if they can't make good decisions and employ this decision-making model, whatever that may be based on the situation, if they can't make those decisions, those mistakes can be have disastrous effects. So I appreciate the way you've worded that.
Thank you for your comments, Chief Mello. Anyone else have any comments, questions? Andrew, can we can take that down and bring the agenda back up. And
Daryl?
Oh, yes,
Can you hear
Mara.
me? Great,
I
yes.
can.
Is there a model policy through post for recruitment?
Is that
Mara, I can answer that for you.
Sure.
And I know this is difficult for folks, because when you look at law enforcement, you look at these large cities that have tens, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of police officers. Kind of gets small. The largest department has, well, you can consider the state police, but when you look at municipal law enforcement, what are you talking, 200 police officers, right? So departments, there's not one large state police department. Every department has their own charter, their own policy. So they all have their own. In fact, the legislation itself requires not the state to develop, it requires individual agencies to develop that. So while we did put up some guidance, it's only guidance. We being the state, and I would refer to post, don't have the authority to tell departments what to do. Legislation does that. We do have a program, and it's part of the CLES program, and we do have now authority under their requirement to be accredited. Although the state chose to go into clear accreditation, which we have no control over at all what they put in there, as opposed to what we recommended, which would have been state accreditation, which we do have total control over. It could have controlled protocols and could have sent messages out like this. It would have been so much easier. And for some reason, there was overwhelming support to change that, but it didn't pass through. But so I hope that that answers your question.
It does, and it raises another, because I have worked with PDs across the state, and everyone seemingly is doing something a little different. And so the concern is with this recommendation, and everyone proceeding in their own vein or in their own way, how are we going to gain uniformity in the hiring process, and let alone the problems that it would? I know we're not talking about promotional, but in hearing these recommendations, it reminded me of a situation talking with someone who talked about the top 3 rule in terms of who they promote, and how these things would not come into consideration. I know, again, we're talking about recruitment, but it's kind of the same process. So the question is, can we have some basic uniformity in recruitment? And can that be something that comes from post, in terms of a recruitment plan, a recruitment model for every police department to have a standard in which, on how they would proceed?
Can I ask a question? So, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, that was my point, that departments make their own decisions based upon their own needs.
Mm-hmm.
Some are having issues with recruiting. I mean, everyone is now, but let's go pre-2020. Some were having issues with recruiting, some weren't. Some were having issues with diversity, some weren't. For instance, when you look at, probably the majority of the state, when you look at what their demographics are, many of them meet or exceed that. And many feel that that's not enough. So the demographic number is not as significant, because many departments would prefer to go beyond that. If you're talking about how to attract people and how to get more people into the candidate pool, or are you talking the actual selection from that pool, or are you talking both?
Both in a sense that typically what we'll hear people say is, we're working on recruitment and we're having trouble recruiting qualified minority candidates. But when you ask what they've done, there's no real plan in place, or there's nothing really that actually targets and invests in going out into certain communities and recruiting minority. So, is there something that we can say as a recommendation that there be a standard recruitment policy that you do some outreach? These things have to be not only, something that is documented that they hope to do or will do or are trying to do, but that this is your plan. These are the steps that you will follow if you're recruiting.
Sure, and I certainly understand. I believe that's what we're doing here. I believe that's the focus of the work here, to provide a statewide guidance or statewide requirements that certain agencies, all agencies, do certain things regardless of whether or not they feel that they've met their recruitment, their diversity goals. And so I believe that that's what this whole conversation has been about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the second document might provide a little bit more additional information because it's specific to hiring and recruiting, where some of it is about the application process and really giving sort of consideration on how to speed that process up, how to think about certain things. It's a little challenging in that there is no national standard for policing. So every agency, it's a little bit different, but every agency usually decides, although for a post there is a specific requirement. And so, but sort of thinking about things like supportive messaging, and I think this is where I usually hit home on the idea of giving agencies the kind of resources to understanding what messaging might look like, and how to consider kind of what we always say in the kind of the police hiring is there's a guy, Jeremy Wilson, who talked about the bucket, right? And it's about widening the bucket. And that if we continue to sort of recruit and message to only a certain type of person, that may not actually encompass everyone who is well suited to do the job. And that there is some research supported that says, hey, nudging can actually perhaps, increase the diversity within your applicant pool, but that this has to be consistent throughout, right? I know we've had these conversations about, well, what happens at the promotion side, or can we actually retain individuals? And so I see a lot of this as, making the recommendations that there is, one entity, right? And where that's housed, I think is sort of part of this discussion that can be that agencies can go to for advice, and that they're being proactive by pushing out, this is some of the latest on how to consider doing this.
Yeah, I think my point might be missed. I know that, I think it was in the excessive use of force bill, there was a piece about recruitment and the requirement for recruitment. And this recently passed the police accountability legislation. There's a piece about recruitment. And by all accounts, if you talk with law enforcement officers, particularly minority officers, they don't feel that that's in play, meaning that they don't feel that even though it's legislated, that it's happening. So I go back to my question is, with it being a requirement of post, there's more of the potential for, firstly, the awareness. There are many people who aren't aware of this language in the legislation that's been passed over the years. But there would be a greater awareness of the requirements and also oversight. If we put it in some legislation, it won't be any different from all the other pieces of legislation that require recruitment activity, require recruitment protocol. Those have all fallen on deaf ears. And so I think we need to look at how we can, and I know you're talking about accountability, but if we put it in legislation, what's to say that it won't be any different from all the past legislation involving recruitment and diversity and inclusion? So I get it. I hear what you're saying. You know, this is certainly a plan, but if we attach it to a piece of legislation, what makes this any different from all the others?
Mark, can I just add to that? And I don't know if maybe somebody else can answer this better, but the police departments that I'm affiliated, well, I shouldn't say affiliated with, because they're all my partners. From the chiefs I speak to and the work I've seen, there's a lot of interest in trying to diversify police departments. First of all, we're assuming that they're not. I don't know, because I only know my department, and I know that we far exceed our demographics. We triple it in some areas. And so I don't know what departments look like. I've never asked the chiefs, hey, how do you feel about your diversity? Because again, I don't think you can put a number on it. It's so, but this is something that we've spent a lot of our money, our very limited money that we get from municipalities, and bring people forward. In fact, when I first heard Dr. Cringen, my first call was to Andrew and Ken and say, you know, how do we get her, you know, on staff? How do we have more conversations with her? And then I found out that she would be a part of this because it's something we're interested in. So I don't see a lot of resistance to this. I see departments that are longing for the information, certainly longing for the resources, but longing for information, and especially supported by research, by data, and you know, things that maybe we haven't thought of. And there's some innovative ways here. So I think that this is, in my view, and I certainly can't speak for over 100 police departments, but it's something that'll be embraced. And you're right, legislation is going to require what it requires now, that everyone has a plan. I think some do it better than others for whatever reason. Some may put more of an effort into for whatever reason. But it's something that everyone is, in my view, most, at least those that I speak to, are very interested. And again, they're interested for diversity reasons. They're also interested about getting police officers, finding people that want to do this job, because very few people want to do it. And we're already seeing the effects in the academy of the recruits and the difficulties they're having with the discipline and the work itself. And so I think law enforcement going forward, at least in the short term, really has a challenge. So and I'll give you, for instance, 5 years ago, we had 1,200 people apply for Milford. And now we're lucky if we get 150. That's applying, and knowing that most of those people won't qualify. We did something a little bit different this year, and I did it after kind of going through this work for the last year, was instead of hiring based upon a testing instrument, and I've encouraged my colleagues to do it, we're hiring based upon a range. And we're looking at that range because we're not going to hire if the testing instruments are so low that, these are validated instruments and we can argue whether they're good or not, whether that person can succeed, can make it through nearly 3.5 years of or the amount of training that's equivalent to 3.5 years of university time. It's a lot of information and, to absorb during that 9-month period. So we took a range that we felt was acceptable, and instead of hiring in order, because we felt that was where we were really getting hurt in diversity, because those that likely had an access to a higher education could do better often, not always, but often on a test. And that those that were more disadvantaged, especially when it comes to education, that they may not do as well. So we took what we thought was an acceptable range, and we kind of looked at how recruits in the past have scored. Have they been successful in the academy? Can they complete the academy experience and maintain the educational requirements? And so we took this range, which was a big range, and we selected based upon what we wanted that class to look like. And as a result, we have the most diverse class in the history of the police department. And so we feel that without necessarily changing the standards, we change the way we select within that pool. So I think there's certainly creative ways to do it. I also think that agencies are going to look at their own need and determine what their individual needs are. We feel the the need and the obligation to continue to diversify beyond what any type of demographic data, and we're going to continue to do that. And some agencies may not, have that strong of a desire, but at the end of the day, it's up to agencies to really understand and buy into this, because they're the ones that have to put the resources out there. So you can have a requirement that it's being done, but you need to put the right people in the right places for this to truly be effective. And for that, you need cooperation. We need cooperation of those police managers and those police officers that are on these teams, and mayors and first selectmen that are going to fund some of this stuff. Because I think you find when it comes to, well, we criticize police chiefs and police departments for not doing enough training and not doing enough of this, enough of that. Give them the resources to do that, and you'll find they'll do a lot more. And I think even more, this is even more true during this last probably 18 months. Thank you.
I'll just to add to that, I would say, and Daryl might have been a part of some of these discussions. In New London, we had the mayor put together a police accountability task force to come up with recommendations on these same issues. And when it came to recruitment, the kinds of, and obviously, we are going to have to think outside the box and be very creative in terms of recruitment and how we bring people to the table. But in most of the suggestions and the things that we were talking about, what the leadership in the police department, their response is, we would love to do that, but we can't because of post. We were talking about working with some of the standards in terms of agility and working with certain things and being creative, and we would love to, but because of post. So, and I get it that communities are going to have to, and they all want to recruit a diverse group of officers, I'm sure. And, but that's not what we're measuring. I think when I look at a police department that says we're working on our diversity, and you have a diverse community and you look at the people they hired and you don't see a lot of diversity there, that's what I use as my litmus test. And that's what I measure is who you actually hire. And if I don't see the diversity there, then we need to do more in terms of recruitment. But it is definitely a challenge. I get that. And it is regional. It is based on the police department and the community that they serve. My only concern is, again, whatever we do here, as has been done in the past, this is a lot of important work. And we put it on a piece of legislation. And then 2-3 years down the road, we're hearing the same things or doing the same thing or redoing the same thing because no one has embraced this. Police departments aren't even aware of this. So, that is, my question here today is how do we make all the work that's been invested in recruitment something that doesn't fly by the wayside, that isn't overlooked, and that we're assured that this is going to get the attention it needs and deserves.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay.
Sure. Andrew.
I know tomorrow that's a conversation that's happening in multiple, the 3 subcommittees, in particular the disability, improving police interactions with the disability community subcommittee, because I think there's a similar feeling of a lot of good work being done and wanting to make sure that it continues on in some iteration. And I do believe that the chairs plan to have a meeting to discuss something like that. So, we put in as a placeholder, and I think Chief Mello indicated that potentially the Office of the Inspector General isn't the best place for it, but I think we can maybe take a lead from other professions. I know here in higher ed they have they created a Office of Diversity and Equity, something like that, that oversees some of these things. So maybe we can just think about what the best mechanism is.
Wasn't OPM a part of some oversight? I know that came up with racial profiling compliance. that OPM was a resource to kind of use as a, I don't want to say a stick, but a stick, you know, to motivate towns and communities to cooperate or comply.
Yeah, in the Elvin Penn Act, there is language that if an agency doesn't comply with the data reporting elements, that they can withhold funds.
I think this is a great conversation. I know, you know, number one, I always want to say, Chief Miller, I always respect your comments and your leadership since from the day that you've been on these calls. And I think that, you know, there were a lot, not even in this particular group, but in our overall task force, there's some great leadership just by the comments and things that they say. But also, you also point out that there are, and we've had this conversation too, there are other departments that maybe don't follow the same rule book or same guidelines that you do and other chiefs do, right? So how do we make that, like, you know, when we see organizations across the country being intentional about inclusivity, right? Intentional. And then we hear communities crying out for people to look more like me or come from my community and so on and so forth. It can't just be, and I know that this is a heavy lift, but it just can't be where we're saying, well, we can't bind them. We can't, you know, we can't do this, you know, and there's a reason, like when you go to certain states and you go to their communities and you see, like, if you go to an Asian community and you see an Asian officer, that's powerful. Like you're in that community and that there, a lot of the officers look like that community. Where in other communities, that's not the same, and the atmosphere is not the same either. So I think that, you know, how do we as a state, you know, because we have the opportunity, we have the state's ear, how do we have those law enforcement agencies that may be less inclined to be as inclusive? How do we, you know, steer the ship towards that way? And like I think Dr. Crinden pointed out, there are some communities where they reflect they're like people that are in their community. But there are others, like communities I live in, that the officers don't look like nor come from our area or even sound like the people, like, you know, they don't even sound like people that are from our community, right? So that might be a good conversation, but I was just curious. I'd love for us to keep that on our radar.
So one of the things I just wanted, before I pulled it down, the document on recruiting and hiring, something that, you know, I hadn't really thought too much about, and Dr. Crinden brought up, and Michelle Montano, who's assisting us as an intern, help put these images together, is being really mindful about who you're trying to reach. And, you know, in going through particular websites, recognizing what is the imaging, what is the messaging, and does it align with the message of diversity? And so I just thought these were great examples of what could be done. But we also thought that to move it to another level, it would be good to have some discussions with members from diverse communities, potentially from law enforcement backgrounds or those interested in maybe joining law enforcement, of whether or not these resonate, and if they had any particular recommendations. And we could also possibly bring up the concept of what would be a good oversight mechanism as well.
Cool.
Can I ask a question, and not to belabor the point? I know folks have to go. I'd like to know what success would look like in talking about the chair and Tamara, in terms of evaluating departments. What would you use to evaluate? What would success look like? Would it look like, is it numbers? Is it a number that reflects, again, as I mentioned earlier, the demographic makeup of the community? So if you were going to evaluate agencies, or if we were able to collect data and look at every department in the state, to know that there's a problem, like how would you define a problem, and how would you define success?
I will give my answer would be, before we started, we would actually do a survey. We would talk to the community members first. And then once this change has taken place, or an attempted change has taken place, then we would survey again, like in any other research project or anything. We do a pre and a post after at the end to see if there's change and what do people see. Do people feel like the change has been successful? We would talk to the community. I couldn't answer that for myself. I think the issue is that it's always we're asking people who don't. We need impacted people, the community, to be answering the question of what success looks like, right? And that's who we need to be talking to before we implement and after we've already made some changes. That's when you're going to see true success. I could tell you success means one cop, but somebody else could say, well, I don't see it. Many people see the work that we've done so far and they say they don't see any changes. We're wasting our time.
But is that not the point, though, that how do you measure the success? Is it because if you ask 100 people, what do you want your police department to look like? You may get, you're going to likely get a number of different answers. So where we're talking about oversight and we're talking about whether or not departments are doing a good job or they're not doing a good job, is it their plan that we're looking at, or are we looking at the results of that plan? So how would you, right now, if we had a set of data, how would you determine whether a department should be referred to a department that's not doing a good job in terms of hiring, diversity, retention, or promotion?
Can I just tell you, maybe from my perspective, and I look at it a little differently, what I think success would look like, say, in the next 3 years. Okay. I think that in this world, in this realm, success looks like all 100+ police agencies having a detailed recruitment plan that is available on their website that has sought public comment, right? So that to me is step one. There's lots of agencies out there now that they kind of know what they're doing and they talk about put together a strategic plan. How do we increase diversity within our agency? Go out, seek public comment from your community stakeholders so that they have an opportunity to look at and weigh in the plan. And part of the plan should be the departments and the communities setting up their own benchmarks. And then, in 1, 2, 3, 5 years, measuring how close they got to those benchmarks. I mean, we do it, for example, in higher ed all the time, right? There's a chief diversity officer with the university. Most state agencies operate this. I think a lot of municipalities might as well. And they set goals and targets for, in this case, Central Connecticut State University in terms of hiring, recruitment, where to recruit to diversify hiring. Now, they don't always meet their goals, right? They don't always hit the mark, but every year they have to produce an annual report that says, here's what we did, here's where we succeeded, here's where we failed, here, right? And so I just think we're going from a place where, people have talked about it, but we need to move this into, right, a really thoughtful, strategic public plan that is then monitored over time. I don't know that at this point, at least from my perspective, that we could sit here and say that, the police department has to look like the racial makeup of the community tomorrow. There's a lot of barriers to getting us to that place. Some of which police have control over and some of which police don't have control over, right? And so, sure, that's the perfect world. Where do we want to be in 10 or 15 years? But I just think in the beginning, what we can hope for and what we should be articulating as a group is every department has a plan that is informed. And so for me, it's a matter of if in 18 months from, let's say, the time these recommendations are put forward, 20 departments don't have a plan, well, that's the failure, right? Right. That's when you want an intervention, some other group to step in and say, hang on a minute, where's your plan? Where was the community input into the plan? What process did you use to seek the community input? And if some just thumb their nose at it, okay, now that's the problem. And frankly, maybe it's not the OIG. I mean, I tend to look at it going, this is a perfect thing to put into the CLESP standards, right? The tier 1 standard could require, maybe they already do, a plan that meets certain parameters and that the plan gets reevaluated every X number of years and that they publish outcomes on diversity, right, as a first step. So that might be the direction to go rather than Office of the Inspector General, because I'm not sure what the Inspector General does if you don't comply with the plan. I mean, I'm not sure it's a criminal penalty, but you could lose accreditation, right? But that to me is the stick approach that's probably more appropriate. So just some thoughts after listening.
I agree, and that's the direction we've been going in, and I'm glad to hear you say that. But I think what's missing, I think, from our current program is that we don't look at the effectiveness. We just make sure there's a plan, and they have to provide evidence that they have that the plan is in effect.
Yeah, and I think, you know, sorry, go ahead, Tamara.
I was just going to say, and the plan should include using your community partners. You know, sometimes when we hear that PDs have launched this major recruitment campaign and was unsuccessful, or it didn't get many minorities, and we know that we haven't been contacted, then, you know, we were a resource you could have used to help bring in more diverse people. And so, you know, and I just completely co-sign with everything Ken has just said. And I think, again, most importantly is we need a stick somewhere in this process to ensure that people are complying.
And again, I think at least in the interim, right, because we need to get departments to develop a plan, and then step 2, to measure the plan regularly and to have as part of their plan benchmarks that they've established. And when they don't meet those benchmarks, they need to articulate the steps they're taking to remedy that, right? Because this is all going to be different from community to community. And for me, at least step 1, the stick is it impacts your accreditation. To me, that is, you know, since we're moving towards sort of every department needing to be accredited, and without that, there could be significant ramifications. I think that's where we start. And, you know, you might eventually want to move to a more thoughtful place beyond that, but I do think that's probably step 1.
One of the sticks that we considered in our conversation, to take a page out of Mike Lawler's playbook, was just being able to put it out publicly in a place, kind of like a rubric that showed all the various things that a department could be doing and whether or not they were doing them. Some of it is just information on, it was referenced in the recruiting document, the second one there, but, you know, what are the physical requirements? Where do you apply? Like, what are our standards or our aspirations for diversity? Things like that. It could be in a publicly accessible place that a community member could access. So Daryl, the chair, had to hop off, and so I had agreed to take over the meeting for him. Did anybody else have any comments about these 2 particular documents? I think, as Daryl mentioned, we're going to look to forward these to the full task force, but they are still for consideration, modification. And so I think we've heard a number of things today that we can do to.
I had one other quick question. I think it was on the data collection and analysis. I think I wrote a note on that. Who's doing that?
Did we have a recommendation on that in particular, Anne? No.
No, we didn't. We sort of left it open-ended because I think that would take there are probably many different potential entities, right? But we didn't want to recommend one, or whether it would, come out through some other funding stream that the state would be willing to put up.
It would probably be helpful, and maybe, I don't know if, I think what Tamara's getting at is probably important, which is that, if it's just left to departments to sort of self-report, in my experience, a lot will do it, but some will not. And so ensuring that, and again, we don't have to talk about this today, and there's probably, I can think of 4 places off the top of my head that maybe would be responsible for the collection of the data. But it is always helpful when recommendations say, X group should be responsible for compiling this data and reporting it back to the legislature or to the public. It's just an added, because then the burden falls on that entity to hunt down the missing data and to make sure people know when somebody doesn't report. So,
Perfect. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Ken, if you have time on the call on Friday, we can go through those different ones. On my side of the house, we tend to be more kind of politically conservative on, naming a entity without actually knowing what the potential ramifications are. So, but.
And it might be worth, just
That again,
because,
so-
yeah, it might be worth listing in the recommendation a number of
Number of
places
them.
that we
Yep.
don't narrow it, because some might not have the capacity, some might say, so it might be worth saying, in the past, information like this has been collected by one of the following entities, and we would recommend a similar formula be put in place if this were to, be implemented.
If I could just add, I think Connecticut suffers from not having a compliance unit, and we don't. I mean, post, I'm it. Most of the time I'm sitting at my keyboard, and then there's Karen, who is the administrator of Post Academy. She's not part of the council, and her staff is trainers. She has one clerical person. They're all trainers, and so we've taken on year after year after year. We keep saying, "Well, give it to us," but there really needs to be a compliance unit, and so we give some stuff to Sacred Heart. We give a lot to Ken and Andrew. And I say we, the system, and then OPM takes it, some of it. So the piece regarding the recruitment and retention plan that's in the police accountability bill requires, as I said, departments that have a high concentration of minority residents, which is interesting because they never really define what that is. And so now we're struggling with departments that are they're using their own definition. So that needs to be cleared up, but we're working on that. But they have to report to Post, and then we send that to OPM because that's what the legislation said. And I would imagine, Ken, you and Andrew will wind up with that at some point. I'm not quite sure. But it's redundant because every department is already sending it up based upon the CLEF standard. It's already in there. And so they already have that information. So departments are sending it up twice again. So that's in there. I think based upon the information in this document, it gives us, I think, something else to work with. I think we can certainly improve upon that product. And then the only thing that would be missing would be the evaluation of how successful was it? And that's why I'd asked that question.
I'd have to wholeheartedly agree with Chief Mello about a compliance unit, and it's something that maybe this work group wants to consider for a future recommendation before we wrap up our work. I think both Post and the state would benefit from a small team of people whose only job it is to ensure compliance with all of these mandates that are being put on Post.
All right. Any other comments on these particular topics? It's agenda item number 3. If not, we'll go to agenda item number 4, and that's other business. And this is the dialogues and the forums that we've been talking about for a while. I do know that in talking with the chair, he hopes to take these recommendations and have some forums, public forums on them, these and others from the full task force in the fall. So we're currently in discussions about that, but obviously with how things are progressing with COVID, are not sure if they'd be in person or virtual at this point, or some type of a hybrid. In addition, I had mentioned these particular recommendations. We had considered some, for use a better word, focus groups, or getting people together with some background in this to help with these recommendations. So that would be with Dr. Cringen. And finally, I know we've had some conversations on some youth forums, and we have as part of this subcommittee the folks down at University of New Haven, and we've talked with them about potentially doing some youth-related forums in the fall as well. But I know we have Richard Frieder on here, and I believe Nana just joined us. And Richard, I didn't know if you had any other comments or Nana on the dialogues or forums.
I can share a couple of things from Everyday Democracy. We did have a good conversation several weeks back now with Daryl and Andrew, and tough time of year with people in and out the door on vacation, but we've been making some progress on pulling together a 1 to 2 page concept, sort of a concept paper that we want to share with Daryl and Andrew and with this group. Not quite ready for that, but also the main purpose would be to use it to have conversations with potential funders. Martha McCoy, the CEO of Everyday Democracy, has had very initial verbal conversations with 1 or 2 potential funders, and I think has had a positive response. So we want to try to build on that to have dialogues. We're very much aware, of course, of the timeline and the fact that the task force is scheduled to conclude its work December 31st. So things have to move quickly, and we've done a little talking about maybe having work that has a phase 1 and a phase 2, and have started to talk about a basic idea that you all were just talking about, and that is that the work of the task force is not truly going to be complete when the life of the task force ends. And then the question is how to keep it going and how to follow up on it. So we've started to talk about that in terms of the dialogues. There's probably not enough time now to do a full-blown dialogue initiative, but something significant could be done in the fall. And then another piece could be done afterwards if a structure is set up to support that beyond the life of the task force. So those are some of the ideas that we've been talking about, and we're looking forward to moving as quickly as possible. Andrew, or I know Daryl is gone, but if one of you had a minute to just put in a call to Martha, I think it would help. I mean, Martha is like everybody else. The things that people ask her about are, they somehow sort of get bumped up in terms of urgency. And if she heard from one of you guys just saying that, hey, we're still thinking about this and interested in working with you, I think it could be helpful.
Okay. Will do. Thanks, Richard. Any other comments on this particular agenda item?
Andrew, what
Yes.
do you think about potentially having a forum just for officers alone? For police officers who would be willing to come in and speak on this topic?
I think we have not said no to anything yet, so I could see value in that, definitely. Were you thinking about the topic of diversity in the force, or is it just the transparency and accountability?
I think the diversity piece and recruitment. I know I have talked with a number of people who have a lot to say, and I think would probably be interested in sharing. So I think it would make for an interesting forum.
Yeah, we can certainly bat that about, and I know we've talked about that with Dr. Cringer, so she might have some good ideas about how we can utilize that information and set it up so that it could be best used for the recommendations and the like. Anyone else? If not, just want to remind folks that our next meeting is August 31st at 1 p.m. and then we anticipate that via Zoom as well. And if there are no other comments or business, then we can adjourn. We don't need an official motion for that. So thank you all for your conversation and your presence today. Thank you.